This is going to be a session sharing stories of economic reconciliation. We had a great conversation panel yesterday about UNDRIP and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We're going to go further with that and now talk about kind of opportunities for economic reconciliation and some academic insight and research into Indigenous energy sovereignty, decision-making, and respectful collaboration with Indigenous people and how we can apply those lessons to the remote community clean energy space. I would like to invite the speakers up for that next session. Virtually, we are going to have Chief Leanne from Squamish Nation join us. We will also have Paul Kariya from Coastal First Nations. We heard Coastal First Nations at lunch. So those will be our two virtual speakers. And we have Sarah Ozog, a PhD student from SFU, Simon Fraser University. We also have Jonathan Boron, also a PhD student from Simon Fraser University, and Sean Brennan from Haida Nation. So if they would all like to come up, we could go on this session. And they will all be able to introduce themselves. This is a session that came together pretty quick at the end, so I'm excited to hear kind of the research and what will be shared.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for being with us here today. And do we have Chief Joe and Paul on the line? Great. Okay. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the Kwanlun Dun and the Tuan Kachin Council for hosting us on their land and the beautiful center, which we've been speaking in the past couple of days. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for wonderful dialogue and discussion over the last couple days. It's been great meeting old and new friends and talking about the issues we care so deeply about. So thank you, everyone. So my name is Sarah Ozog. I'm a PhD student at Simon Fraser University. I study under the supervision of Dr. Cliff Atleo Jr. I'm also a former or recovering BC public servant. And most importantly, I've had the utmost privilege of working with several First Nations on the coast, some of which are here with us today. Thank you. So today, we're here to talk to you about economic reconciliation, and I'm really excited about the panel that we've pulled together. Thank you for the support. We'll have Chief Leanne Joe of the Squamish Nation. She will introduce the topic, and then from there, we've arranged several different perspectives on the topic of economic reconciliation. First, we'll have John Boron offering an academic perspective. Then we'll have Paul Kariya from the Coastal First Nations offering a perspective from a non-governmental organization. And then last, we'll have Sean Brennan of the Haida Nation offering a community-based perspective and what that means for him. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Chief Leanne Joe. If we can bring her up on the screen, and I'll introduce her. Wonderful. Chief Leanne Joe is a hereditary chief of the Squamish Nation and the first female chief of her family. She's a trustee for the Squamish Nation Trust and is currently Simon Fraser University's transformative storyteller for economic reconciliation. She will be releasing a framework for economic reconciliation in BC next month, and today we have the privilege to hear her introduce the topic from her own research and evaluation. So thank you, Chief Joe.
Oziam. Thank you for having me today. My name is Shapayla Matsum. I hail from the beautiful shores of Oslahan and North Vancouver. I live, work, and play in the traditional territories and unceded territories of the Inca, Catlam, Shuswap, and Syilx speaking peoples in the beautiful Nicola Valley. I want to quickly jump into my work. It wasn't, traditional research around economic reconciliation. I don't define economic reconciliation as a one-size-fits-all. My work really leans towards and is founded in an Indigenous worldview, lens, epistemology, space, whatever you want to call it, and informs the framework that will be coming out in May, and has framed our engagement process with Indigenous communities across British Columbia, and as well as the challenges in translating that worldview to a settler society that thinks of economic systems in a very unique way, which is can be quite different than an Indigenous worldview of governance and economy and well-being, what I like to call well-being. And so to frame and begin, we know, as Sarah mentioned, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples explains that creating a healthier Indigenous communities must be self-determined by Indigenous peoples and supported by all of society. I can't agree wholeheartedly. My whole entire framework is based on that notion, that idea, that space. And how do we then work together collaboratively in reciprocity to achieve that? For me, that's what economic reconciliation is going to needs to be and should be moving forward. And there are many opportunities and many spaces that have already been created, have been successful, but there are many more to come. And this will take so many spaces, right, of cities, municipalities, regional districts, NGOs, nonprofits, community economic development practitioners, and the like. Like, there's just, each of us has a role to play in economic reconciliation. No rock needs to be left unturned until we can get to the space of self-determination of the over 204 First Nations communities in British Columbia. And I hope that the idea of economic reconciliation isn't lost on anyone. And each of us is speaking in unique ways, right? You look at all of the players, both regionally and nationally, that are speaking to this, and in various ways, from entrepreneurship, from corporate development to partnership. Again, many spaces where we have the ability to take action now. Because at the end of the day, what it comes down to is what legacy are we leaving behind? And the legacy for our future generations. I have a teenage son who I don't want to be having the same conversation with your children or grandchildren. We have the responsibility to really affect what I call transformative change in economic reconciliation. And that again comes down to each nation deciding and leading that work. Because if they're not leading it, then we're falling into silos of pan-indigeneity and prescribed toolkits and guides and the like to this reconciliation journey. And my work isn't specifically in the clean energy sector. It is in all sectors for many people in many spaces. But I wanted to take the time and to think about what that means. And I'm sure you have done that over the past 2 days and will continue to do that moving forward. But the key is, how do we do that both personally as well as professionally, and intertwine all these spaces of opportunity, and being curious about unique and different ways of achieving it, and having it be values-based, and also considering what is at the center of all of this well-being. Who is at the center of all of this well-being? I lead with a lot of questions, which I hope leads to curious spaces of thought leadership about allyship, healing, forgiveness, and then actually actions towards both reconciliation, but more specifically economic reconciliation, um, across the globe, not just here regionally, but across the globe. And what does that look like for each of us? Again, I have no hard and fast solutions. I don't have tick boxes towards this journey. But just again, wanting to lay this foundation of curiosity and hope and mindfulness about the reciprocity needed to create the future for the future generations to come. And I know that Paul and Sarah and Jonathan and others will be speaking very specifically to clean energy projects and research and the like around this sector. And I want to open up the floor to them to speak to that specifically with the mindset of the foundation I've laid here today. Ocean.
Thank you, Chief Joe. With that, we'll ask Jonathan Boron to come up. I'd like to introduce John. Very excited to introduce John. He's a PhD candidate and of Hodashoni and European heritage from 6 nations of the Grand River in Ontario. His research is driven by a passion for community planning, and in his latest work, he theorizes on relational self-determination and the important role of shared decision-making with Indigenous peoples in the natural resource sector. Thank you, John.
I think I'm going to come up here, if that's okay. Yeah. Do I got slides? Awesome. I also brought my notes up here because I'm a little nervous. Skano, hello. My name is Jonathan Boron. I'm Hodashoni Kayuga from 6 Nations of the Grand River. I'm also a PhD student at Simon Fraser University in resource and environmental management. And my research looks at pathways to self-determination in resource governance and resource relationships. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge and give thanks to the territory, the Tan, Kwacha, and Kwanlan Dun territory. I also wanted to acknowledge all of the territories that have been a part of our conversations here over the last couple of days. And I wanted to give thanks to the sun, to the winds, the waters, and the land for their gifts. Without them, we wouldn't be here talking about renewable energy, and I wanted to acknowledge that. So my research as I said, looks at pathways to self-determination and resource governance, specifically in the mining and extractive industries, so a bit adjacent to everyone else in this room. This is my first time in like a renewable space, and I really like the conversations. It's really generative, really positive. It's an exciting field to be in. Yeah, so as a PhD student, I get to spend a lot of time sitting and thinking. And with COVID, I've had a lot more time to sit and think. So I want to maybe share some of my thoughts with you around economic reconciliation. Oops. There we go. So I wanted to start with this word reconciliation. A lot of people have a lot of different definitions of what it means, and I wanted to share with you what it means to me as I ground it culturally. The Hodashoni people have traditionally used wampum beads and wampum belts to denote and codify our relationships, our stories, and our laws. Many of our wampum belts are created to symbolize our binding treaty relationships. This is the Gaswantha, the Turo wampum. I'm sure some of you have seen it before. It's been around for a while. It's a treaty agreement that was made with my ancestors in the 17th century and Dutch settlers. It was also agreed to by the British Crown at the Treaty of Niagara. The Gaswantha is a belt of purple and white rows of wampum beads and is the philosophical foundation for how the Haudenosaunee have conducted their relationship with Europeans ever since contact, as sovereign and independent peoples. The design of the wampum has two parallel rows of purple beads that run horizontally across the belt, split by 3 lines of white wampum. These 2 purple lines are said to represent 2 ships, one denoting the Haudenosaunee and the other representing the European settlers. And within these ships, we carry with us our own distinct ways of being, our culture, our language, our history, and our laws. As these 2 vessels coexist, traveling down the river of life, the white wampum, together, they are considered separate but equal, with the understanding that neither are to interfere with each other's vessels. This coexisting relationship between sovereignties is supported by 3 rows of white wampum, the space in between the 2 purple lines. These 3 rows of white wampum beads signify the principles of peace, friendship, and respect. Peace, friendship, and respect that are the foundation of our shared coexistence. If our relationship no longer holds up these principles, then our coexistence is broken. And we know that this relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples has been broken for a long time. And so this is where I come to reconciliation. It's about fixing these broken relationships, to get back to a place of coexistence as equals. I also want to acknowledge that this treaty relationship has a third partner, the river. Reconciliation also relies on our ability to restore our relationships and respect for our lands and waters. So moving this understanding of reconciliation to the concept of economic reconciliation, I want to share with you a few of the questions and thoughts that I have. As Chief Leanne Jo said, she leads with a lot of questions. Well, I ask a lot of questions too. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. So the idea of participation as reconciliation has been pitched and talked about a lot. This idea of having a seat at the table and closing the gaps. I study colonization and settler colonialism, and so when I hear the word participation, I have a lot of questions, and a lot of red flags go off in my head. Having a seat at the table, what type of economic system is feeding that table? Closing the gaps, who's guiding this? Are these gaps actually closing? And whose values are driving the economic development to get us to close that gap? We need to ask ourselves, what is it that we are participating in? And so again, working in the extractives industries, talking about impact benefit agreements, my work asks, what are we gaining, but also what are we giving up? There's a lot of short-term economic, oh, that's great, thank you. A lot of short-term economic benefits and jobs that no doubt can be transformative for our communities, but it also shifts our economic dependency to resource extractive economies and all of the impacts that are associated with them. This type of economy may not align with our community values, and it perpetuates unsustainable relationships. These relationships harm our relationships to our lands, our waters, our plants and animals, which further harms alternative economic opportunities. It harms our food relationships, our food security, our food sovereignty, and it harms our community health. It also causes harm to other communities. And so here is, I think, where there's a lot of connection in regards to mining, international relations of extraction. So we need to think about, in our renewables space, we need to think about the materials that are feeding our infrastructure. And where are we sourcing that material from? And are those relationships equitable, sustainable, consent-based? So I ask again, who's setting the table? I've studied a lot of agreements, reconciliation agreements, participation agreements, nation-to-nation agreements, co-management agreements, and they all follow the same type of consultation framework. They all nest self-determination under Crown sovereignty, reproducing a colonial relationship. As Bruce McIver said yesterday, We need to move away from this consultation model. I'm sure a lot of you in the room have seen this type of model in the work that you do. We need to focus on our relationships to build consent through peace, friendship, and respect for Indigenous self-determination. And so that leads me to my main overarching point. Economic reconciliation is not economic participation, it's economic self-determination. Through economic self-determination, we lift up our Indigenous governing systems while renewing sustainable economic relations. We reconnect our relationships to the earth and reconnect our community values to the governing decisions that we're making. It's also giving us an opportunity to reconnect our trade relationships with one another around sustainable mining and renewable energy. So I just wanted to end with a call for centering community values and centering community consent. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Very important questions. Okay, next we'll have Paul Kariya. Paul's going to be calling in from Vancouver Island. Is Paul ready to go? I'll introduce Paul. I'll introduce you, Paul, here.
Great, thank you.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Kariya, providing a perspective from coastal First Nations, which is formed to promote sustainable economic development on BC's coast. Paul currently holds the role of Senior Policy Advisor, and in previous roles, Paul was the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Association of British Columbia and Executive Director of the Pacific Salmon Foundation, the CEO of Fisheries Renewal BC, and a former Executive Director of the BC Treaty Commission. Thank you, Paul. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Let me acknowledge the Kwantlen Dun and the other First Nations who are hosting this wonderful conference. I wish I could be with you, but I am sitting in a ferry parking lot in Nanaimo territory, trying to get across the waters here to Vancouver. Thank you for Chief Leanne for setting the stage and for Jonathan's talk to whet the appetite in terms of economic reconciliation. And I also look forward to Sean's comments as he works directly with one of the member nations of the CFN. I also want to acknowledge that contingent of climate action coordinators that are there at the conference in person, and a shout out to Jillian and Dana and Leona and team that work with CFN. I wonder if I could get the one slide that I have put up onto the graphic so that you can see. CFN and its member nations are known for the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement and the series of protocols that were negotiated a decade ago. The nations aren't finished in terms of their work and negotiations with British Columbia, but there you can see in the green what's been achieved in terms of protected areas. And there are many facets to it, whether they're park or conservancies and whatnot. But we want to move from that, not that it's fully finished, but on the right-hand side, there should be another graphic pop-up of another map. Hopefully it pops up. There we go. And the goal is to bring the work that the nations have been doing for the last, probably 6, 7, 8 years in the marine, and where the Great Bear Rainforest is built upon an ecosystem-based management approach. If we're really to truly embrace that, the nations want to see the oceans and the marine tied to the protected areas in green on the terrestrial. And that's what Reconciliation 2.0, which we've embarked upon with the BC government in the next little while and hope to achieve this year, is a new negotiated agreement, new set of protocols. And so we title it Completing the Work, and the chiefs and leaders have met with the BC cabinet, with deputy ministers, and there are a series of technical meetings upcoming on this. The mission of CFN GBI is really to support the nations with their rights and title. GBI is just a not-for-profit. We're created by the nations. We have limited responsibility, and our two key mission areas after supporting the nations with their rights and title is to protect the environment. We come out of an environmental activism and a protection kind of ethic and mandate. And then the third area of mission is enabling sustainable economies to develop. Let me take you through a few high-level examples from a policy point of view, the area that I work in, and maybe using carbon management as a guiding tool, as the academics in the room would say, a heuristic learning device. And so if I begin with political strategy, there is no reason for these nations to come together other than in historic in prehistory, pre-colonial history times. The nations did work together for different causes. In this post-colonial time, the nations work together to protect the environment. We're not a tribal council. Our organization is not tribally based. It's interests that bring the nations together. And on the political front, the environmental front, the nations are pleased, proud, and have led the stopping of the Enbridge oil pipeline. And then most recently, led the charge for Bill C-48 through the Canadian Senate, the Northern Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which passed in 2019. These are huge milestone events against that mission I just spoke of about protecting the environment, enabling sustainable economy. Reducing the carbon pollution, if you will, has been a key part of the broad work of the nations. If I turn to the economic strategy, for sure, it's about jobs and revenue to sustain governments that need revenue. It's to ultimately lead to that human well-being point that was raised by the previous two speakers. And in that, then, the nations together host the largest forest-based carbon offset project in Canada and one of the largest in the world. And this is a huge carbon management tool. The nations themselves are working hard to reduce and eliminate the use of fossil fuels for their own power generation. And the folks I mentioned earlier that are attending the conference are central to that, the climate action coordinators. It is to reduce the diesel bill, but also to lead to healthier communities. Maybe something else I'd highlight, sorry, there's a ferry announcement if you can hear it in the background, is the Fisheries Reconciliation Agreement that our nation signed with Canada in the fall of 2021. It will revolutionize the West Coast commercial fishery, and it will help reestablish a small boat artisanal fleet, of which used to be such an important part of each of our nations, and it doesn't exist anymore. For many young people, the only access to water is probably a water taxi. But we want to recreate that small boat fleet as fishing platforms for families to get back on the water to do their harvesting. And that silly artifice that's existed for over 100 years of you can't be selling your food catch, that artifice will disappear. If you want to catch it and take it home and eat it, great. If you want to sell it, you're going to be able to do that. And it won't be just one or two species. Under the reconciliation agreement that our nations have signed with Canada, it'll be all species. All the species that are under what the DFO would say are the integrated fish management plans that they have. So I think it's 23 listed species. And what's important in the collaborative governance that we've negotiated is that from what Jonathan mentioned earlier, this is not under Crown sovereignty. And so right now, if you think about the IFMPs, the fish plans, the minister sits at the table and all stakeholders sit in front, including First Nations. Maybe they get a special consultation dialogue. Under the new structure, which has been agreed to in the agreement, it'll be First Nations sitting with the minister. So it's joint sovereignty, if you will, under which the plans will be put together. Moving along in terms of a sustainable revenue, even with this new fisheries agreement, under the management plans that the nations will negotiate, they don't want to prosecute at the level that has been in the past. It will be a much less intensive fishery. Forestry by design, the nations have agreed to reduce the annual allowable cut. That's what generates the carbon offset regime we have. And tourism, similarly, is not going to be boatloads of people disgorging into the communities. So where will the future revenues and jobs come from? It could be from a Northern Power Authority, buying and selling power, sitting beside the Crown Corporation, BC Hydro. We can talk about that in the Q&A. We've got an award-winning Guardian program that we're under Reconciliation 2.0 negotiating full compliance enforcement powers. The training has been there. The bringing together of the marine and the terrestrial will see one of the largest, what they call projects for permanence in the world. And we're in a competition, and I think some of the boreal nations are similarly chasing PFPs with the philanthropy community. We want to, under this kind of reducing carbon management regime, the nations aspire to be leaders in the clean space, clean fisheries, clean forestry, if you will, using that metaphor of clean, but also then in terms of what the environment will look like. Let me stop there, and I look forward to a Q&A that we can get into some more of the details about what the CFN nations are up to. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, last but not least, to offer a community perspective, we have Sean Brennan of the Haida Nation. Sean currently serves as Implementation Manager for the Tilyata Energy Corp, a 100% Haida-owned entity delivering their first renewable energy project. Sean will share lessons learned from his previous role at the Joint Solutions Table, where the Haida Nation and the province of BC share in forestry management decisions on Haida Gwaii, and he intends to reflect on how to bring this experience with him to his new role in the Haida energy transition.
How Sarah. My name is Nunks Kayas. That means the one I found. I'm also called Sean Brennan. I'm from the Haida Nation, from a village in Old Masset on the north end of Haida Gwaii. And I'm going to talk about how all my experience, I guess, with the Solutions Table and talking with the province of BC mainly. So the Haida Nation is made up of Old Masset and Skidegate band councils, and we've come together and created the Council of the Haida Nation, which includes our hereditary chiefs as well. There's a hereditary chiefs table, and everyone has a say. And so my career started in forestry, as Sarah mentioned, and it came about as a result of the TFL 39 case, where the court said, the Supreme Court of Canada said that the Crown had they said that there was a duty to consult and accommodate. And at that time, we were working with the logging companies directly, actually, particularly Weyerhaeuser, which was the largest logging company on our island. And so I mainly just did what was called cultural value surveys, and it was basically going out and walking through each forest cut block while it still stood, looking for culturally modified trees, monumental cedars, cultural plants, fish habitat, different values that we identified previously to logging companies, and we'd been fighting for quite a while. Now we're saying, at that point we were saying, no to everything that had any of these values, right? And the court case got, it got elevated, and the next decision came down saying that that duty to consult and accommodate didn't fall on industry, but it fell on the Crown. And so we got taken out of that logging company, but we still had the Forest Guardians, where we were still doing those cultural value surveys. And that led to the land use plan after protests, right? So basically, in BC, almost all of the forestry changes legislatively had come from social unrest and protest, right? 2005, we had the Island Spirit Rising protest, which we said enough is enough. We don't really want large-scale clear-cut logging happening on Haida Gwaii anymore. And that started the whole land use plan. So we began working with the province of BC to identify all those areas that Paul mentioned earlier throughout Haida, which were turned into protected areas or conservancies, as BC called them. And we also established cedar stewardship areas. We have 25,000 hectares of cedar stewardship areas in Haida, which is set aside strictly for cultural use, and they're most of that area is either contains large monumental cedar right now, or an area to recruit large monumental cedar in the future. It's part of our 1,000-year cedar plan to continue having cedar into the future. And then from the land use plan, I stopped working in forestry so much and started working on this joint governing body called the Solutions Table. And the Solutions Table was born from that land use plan because we said that there was an area where there was conflict that we needed an intergovernmental process to resolve that sort of conflict whenever there was whenever it arose between the First Nations and industry. And so that intergovernmental process became the Solutions Table, which was made up of 2 members of the province, 2 members of the Haida Nation, and we would get together and sort of make decisions on, or not make decisions, but we would take a look at every application, whether it was forestry, lands, applications, water, anything to do with the provincial government that they had to review. We also reviewed with them, right? And that was going great. It was awesome. We worked together really well until we came to areas where we didn't agree. And that happened particularly around logging cup blocks that contained large amounts of monumental cedar. We called those non-consensus applications. And we didn't really know what to do with them because within that sort of framework, we were sort of under the impression that we had that shared decision making was an actual shared decision. Like we came together and made it together, right? But shared decision making isn't actually like that. Shared decision making is basically one power having that decision making power, but sharing that analysis of what that decision would look like with somebody else. Joint decision making is when 2 parties come together and they actually come and make a decision together on a consensus basis. So that sort of led to more conflict, right? Because when you have things of value, like a cedar tree, it's also valuable economically. And I should mention that through our land use plan was born the reconciliation agreement. So within that reconciliation agreement, we said, you know, this logging company is really problematic for us, and we'd like to just buy them out. We'd like to own that, to have all of the power of what happens on our land, right? And so the government of Canada said, yeah, sure, let's do that. They gave us the money to acquire that logging company, and we said, you know, we also have these fishing lodges that are kind of problematic, and one of them's up for sale, and can we throw that in there too? And that's what happened. And so that sort of created the Haida Enterprise Corporation, or HICO. And so we had those two companies going, and you know, at first it was great. Everyone's like really proud that we have this going on, but then it came time to start making money, and we had to start logging trees, you know what I mean? And that didn't sit well for everybody, myself included. It came down to, like, you know, I was sort of saying, you know, there's possible ways to do this without having to go that route, and then yeah, so I'm not going to get too into the nitty-gritty about like all of our conflict or anything like that, but I would like to talk about how that relationship is really important. So when there's something of value, and that value is both cultural and economic, there is conflict, and there's always going to be that conflict. But there's also an opportunity in there for improvement and having that economic opportunity. So I really feel that that Canada's future is directly connected to the quality of the relationship of your First Nation, right? We weren't able to go and do all this stuff without the province of BC, and we weren't able to get anything done without, you know, laying all our issues out on the table and saying, you know, there's a problem here and we need to resolve this. Reconciliation is sort of like gotten muddied in the waters because people really think that reconciliation should be what it's sort of defined as, which is when two parties have a problem and they both admit that there's a problem and they come together to sort of resolve that. Right now what we have is a lot of different First Nations saying that there's a major problem and not a whole lot of action from Canada. So it's sort of an ongoing process of maintaining that respectful relationship with the Indigenous people of your territory. So sort of reflecting on these experiences in forestry, I sort of wanted to know, like, how can we apply this into our own clean energy projects? And then I really feel like these clean energy projects are dependent on a good relationship with your utility or your government to get that buy-in and that sponsorship, because you're not going to get anywhere without having the utility buy-in. You're going to create a project and no one's going to buy your electricity, right? So I really feel like that needs to come to the table from both us, but especially from government or Crown or whoever you're dealing with. And so I just really feel like, I don't know, I kind of want to reflect on that and think about how we could do better. There's different situations where things can get stalled out and there's still opportunities to speed things up and think outside the box. There's a lot of real mentality that's stuck in their old ways, pre-reconciliation maybe, without giving up any of their power or whatever, right? Like people they don't like it when people start breaking the China. I don't know where Chris is, but it's true. Like once you start doing that, then people freak out and they don't really know how to react to this new approach of doing things where it's inclusive. So I really just want to reflect on how we could do better. How?
Thank you, Sean. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. I'll kick us off because I really would like to reflect back to Judith Sayre's very strong and pointed comments yesterday when she opened up and she stated that economic reconciliation, it's more than just grants, it's more than just funding. And so over the last couple days, and this panel included, we've talked about some of those other mechanisms or some of those other approaches that government can take to contribute to economic reconciliation. Paul Kariya referred to some policy mechanisms, and here we've talked about shared decision-making. So I'd like to turn it back to the panel then and ask them how do you see either some of these policy mechanisms or shared decision-making apply specifically in the renewable energy context? And I'll start with you, Paul, if you're still with us on the line. No, he's not.
I think he lost his sound and is going to call right back in.
Okay, no problem. Chief Leanne, did you want to speak to shared decision-making at all and its role in economic reconciliation?
Broadly speaking, it comes down to let's get out of our own ways sometimes, and really look at what we're centering for the well-being of all of us. right? Because if we're being inclusive, I mean, I just loved what was just shared at the end of that presentation about being curious and creating foundational space for the possibilities of being inclusive as humanity and our reciprocal relationship with all living creatures, our higher selves or spirit, and the four elements. And because our water, our trees, our resources, they're all living things as well. And yes, we might be at the top of the food chain per se, but without any of these things, we cease to exist also, right? And I know that doesn't answer your question specifically, but it is, again, being curious about that inclusivity and inclusion space that I think we need to move towards to transform what is possible, both inside First Nation communities and to, again, our global economy as a whole.
Thanks, Leanne. Paul, I saw you pop up there. The question was, some of those other tools beyond government grants, such as policy mechanisms, as you mentioned, or shared decision-making, how do you see those apply specifically in the renewable energy context? I see him.
Thanks for that. I hope you can hear me. Maybe I can only speak from the nations I work for. We are lobbying hard under Reconciliation 2.0, government to government with the province, that it's not so much power calls that we need. It's not so much BC Hydro. It is that economic development regionally has been used as a tool for the province's development in the past, largely to the detriment of the environment and First Nations. So whether it's the Northeast or the Southeast or the Lower Fraser, let's use that same kind of policy mechanism for good. Why don't we have electricity development as a tool for economic development in the Northwest? And then from there will flow a number of decisions that will perhaps lead to the creation of a body like the Columbia Basin Power Authority and Trust, which could be modeled, a Northern Power Authority could be modeled after that. Why couldn't we have a Crown agency, perhaps with a board from the First Nations, or it could be joint with First Nations and other Northern residents sitting beside BC Hydro, buying and selling power, getting access to their monopolized transmission lines so that power can be wielded through export agreements to the US, with Canada's participation in building out transmission and distribution lines, increasing the tie to Alberta and eastward. So policy writ large, I guess, is what needs to happen, but it will come out of that G to G relationship.
Thanks, Paul. John or Sean, I'm not sure if the mics are working. Give them a try.
Come on, there we go. Yeah, I think that something that I've been thinking about is Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are sharing this land together, and so I think when we make our decisions around renewables and or around energy and energy production, we need to center the land in those decisions. For example, damming a river is not necessarily the best route for a lot of communities. A lot of well, not only Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities, but also like fish communities, the caribou communities, the tree communities, all of that land that's going to be taken when you do dam a river. So thinking about alternatives that are in line with how we operate together on the land, I think, is what we need to think about.
Thanks, John. I am directed here to look at WOVA or the multipurpose room for the next question. Okay, question here on WOVA. Are CFN nations interested in clean energy as an avenue for economic reconciliation? What are some opportunities and challenges?
I guess that's for me. For sure, it is one of our priority topics. As I mentioned earlier, the traditional economies probably cannot sustain the populations in the nations. And so what are the best options? Well, as I mentioned, we are Canada's largest forest-based carbon offsetter, and that does bring in revenue and helps with careers. It's channeled into the stewardship work we do. But the other big area is probably in the clean energy area. And as I say, I think the vision is of a power authority, buying and selling power for export tying into the grid and being able to wield that power throughout North America. And that could be a basket of, I take the comments from Jonathan about impact on the land. I think our nations would choose carefully. We've studied the basket of, run of river to wind to onshore and offshore to solar to hydrogen and battery. I think it would be a diversified basket of opportunity, if you will, studied carefully. And yeah, there may even be the opportunity for some smaller flood storage, but I think fish values would have to come into that. What we're seeing so much with the impact and the crisis in salmon is some of it is just the lack of water in the end stage of migration because of the changing hydrograph. There isn't water for adults to make it back home. There may be the need for pulse release of cold water in some of these systems, the smaller coastal Central Coast systems and that might serve then the dual purpose of water with the first priority for fish. The second priority could be for a capacity tool for energy if the transmission lines and that are close by. So for sure, clean energy is something that the nations are looking at.
Thanks, Paul. Are there any questions from the multipurpose room?
Any questions? No, thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. We do have one question.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Larissa Stendy. I work with a not-for-profit, mainly focused around housing, but I just always am kind of astounded. I know the overlap is probably there too with some of the green energy projects and whatnot, about the lack of coordination and cooperation between government levels for funding, like the heavy administrative burden on communities to pursue funding that is often expected to be stacked, has burdensome reporting expectations, the unaligned deadlines and timelines between different funding pots. Like, I'm really encouraged to see the presentation earlier today about the cooperation between PBC and New Relationship Trust and these funds and whatnot, but but I just think, if governments are really interested in economic reconciliation, streamlining this and making it really facilitated to be accessing these funds to complete projects and not just piecemeal it continually and put that burden on figuring it out to overstretched nations is really would be a big step in the right direction. Because again, these goals are huge. We got to remember the climate emergency piece and that we're trying to forward the autonomy piece. And I think that just recognizing that could be streamlined, and that should be actually something the governments should be doing intergovernmentally and not leaving it to communities to figure out. Anyway.
Excellent question. Thank you for that. Yeah, very real issue. How they're can be certain improvements and increased coordination among various governments. Chief Leanne, I saw you respond enthusiastically to the question. Would you like to say anything?
Nothing specific other than the burden is, I just want to reiterate that, it's already been stated very clearly through that question, but the burden always resides, the ball is always in our court to find that funding, to coordinate and piecemeal, like mentioned, so many different spaces to achieve the kind of economic development that creates the well-being in our communities. And I think I don't have an answer other than to state that but I only speak for myself and potentially my community when I say this, we're tired of putting that ball back in the government's court, right? It's exhausting, and I don't see the need for it anymore if we're talking about true reconciliation, whether it's the first version, second version, third version, or the 10th version. God help us if we have to go to a 10th version. Yeah, let's demand, I guess more from our government to take the bull by the horns and simplify a lot of these processes and policies and, non-pragmatic spaces that continue to hinder what we know to be right and true for our self-determination.
Thank you. Sean, do you want to offer anything?
I mean, yeah, on that note, I'm working on a solar project right now in Masset, and we have 5 funding sources that we're going to, right? So I totally feel that, and I do think that government should step up. I'll recognize that NRCan has worked towards recognizing that is a problem, and in the last few months, I have felt that they have been putting an effort in there, but there's still a big gap.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your ears and being a wonderful audience today. And John and Sean, thank you. Paul and Chief Leanne, really appreciate your time.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Okay, that gave me lots of thoughts to think about on making that connection between academic and on-the-ground experience from Sean and forestry and fisheries and how to apply that to clean energy.